Welcome to another enlightening episode of the Cohort Sisters podcast, where we give voice to the stories, struggles, and successes of Black women and non-binary folks with doctoral degrees. I'm your host, Dr. Jamakola, and today I'd like to introduce Dr. Tara Pixley. With an MFA in photography and a Ph.D. in communication, she's a visual journalist, strategic storytelling consultant, and esteemed professor with over 2 decades of media production and editorial experience. As a queer, first-generation Jamaican American raised in the Southeast U.S., she's deeply committed to reshaping visual narratives around themes like immigration, Blackness, LGBTQ+ communities, and the Global South. Her work challenges conventional portrayals of gender, race, class, and sexuality in photography, both in her personal projects and scholarly pursuits. She's a 2022 Pulitzer Center Diversify Photo Eyewitness Photojournalism grant recipient, focusing on the pressing environmental justice issue of LA urban oil production. She's also a 2022-2023 Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellow, working on a project called Source of Safety, which addresses identity-aware safety resources for visual journalists. And as if that wasn't enough, she's also a founding member and executive director of Authority Collective, championing inclusivity and transformative projects in the realm of visual media. So much going on. Welcome, Dr. Pixley, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank
So
you
tell
for
us a
that
little
lovely opening.
You're welcome. I mean, you do so much. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where, we know you are Jamaican American. We know you grew up in the Southeast. What else should we know about you? Like, who is Dr. Pixley outside of her amazing bio and all of her wonderful accomplishments?
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much again for having me and for creating this space. It's so wonderful. Um, I don't know how to, I think if I were going to say one thing that is really integral to who I am as a person that is not in my bio, it's that I had children very young. I had my son 2 weeks after I graduated undergrad. I was at Florida A&M University getting my bachelor's in philosophy and journalism. And it was certainly an unplanned early parenthood, but um, I think that had so much impact on who I became and my work ethic and just my relationship to the world. And so my 2 children, my son is now 17, Caden Noble, and my daughter is 13, Bryn. Um, and the 2 of them are wonderful little human beings, and they really inform so much of my work. And they've been such amazing role dogs, just like, I'm like, mommy's going to grad school, and they're like, okay, we pack up the car and drive across the country from Atlanta to San Diego when they were 2 and 6 years old, and
Wow.
started a life very far away from all of our family. And so that being in grad school, my doctoral program, without really any uh, family or friends network that we had in existence, we built a new one that was really incredible in Southern California. But just having that shift in my perspective and my relationship to people in space throughout my career has really informed so much of the work that I do. And I think I'm really, really lucky to be able to move through these different spaces. I didn't really understand when I was starting in my doctoral program that academia is its own profession. I was a first generation college student. No one in my family understood what it was to get a PhD, really, and neither my mom didn't even go to high school. My father didn't finish um, his, didn't go beyond high school, and so everyone valued education a lot, but we did not have a frame of reference for a doctoral program. And I wanted to get my PhD, as I said, to be undeniable. I didn't want to give anyone a reason to say I didn't have the credentials to do X, Y, and Z. So I'm actually thinking about getting an MBA and a law degree now, and just like, what is the next level of what else do I need to do to make sure these people can't tell me no, and that I can speak from experience and expertise. Yeah, so very, very long-winded answer, but I think those are the things that have really informed who I am as a person, is being a young parent and working through a lot of different spaces of journalism and academia, and now consulting, also doing equity work and working in the nonprofit space.
Yeah. Okay, I have trying to decide which direction I want to go into because I have two like different lines of questioning that I want to ask. I'm going to ask one and hopefully I can remember to get back to the other one. So I believe, and if someone is listening, a past guest is listening, and I'm completely wrong, my bad. But I believe that you're one of the first guests on the podcast who has shared that they started graduate school with very young children who also made a move across the country. I think oftentimes when folks are talking about, where to go to grad school. We actually just had a workshop earlier this week where our speaker was telling us, like, your advisors might tell you apply everywhere, go everywhere, but like that's not necessarily the reality for Black folks. But then also, I think this element of moving that is so commonly associated with an academic life, whether it is moving for grad school or moving for an academic job or moving after 3 years if you don't like that place, or moving for tenure, whatever it is, that kind of instability is often clashes with having a family and family stability. So I would love if you could just speak a little bit more to the decision to move cross country. Did you explore any institutions on the East Coast where you and your family were before you came to California? Just what was that transition like? Because I feel like it's one thing to move yourself across the country. It's another thing to move yourself and little children. So I would just love to know a little bit more about that.
Honestly, it's I'll tell you my story of then, and then also my story of now, because I have a moving story that's like kind of unfolding right now related to my career in academia. And I will say it's much easier to move younger children than it is to move older children. When I was taking my son, he had just finished kindergarten, and my daughter was in this really wonderful preschool that we loved, but it wasn't this big deal to move them. They were so young that we talked to my son, we said, Caden, are you worried about anything? Are you sad to leave your friends? And he said, I'll make new friends. That's him at 6 years old. And it's true. We made new friends immediately. All of us did. And so in retrospect, that it wasn't as emotionally, and strategically difficult as now, which I'll get to in a second. And I think something that's important is I didn't have a lot of family help with raising my kids, so it wasn't like I was leaving like this great network, and because I was a young parent, I didn't have other young parents, or I didn't have other parents around me. Like, I was the only one of my friends that had children. So I actually moved to a more supportive community where there were other parents when I went into grad school in San Diego, because I was moving into graduate housing that was geared towards families. And so we actually went from having very, very little support for raising two young children to having a ton of support, and being in this vibrant, beautiful community of people of all ages, with children of all ages. And our kids grew up together over those 6 years of grad school. It was really amazing. But we had a very different experience when I got my job after grad school, and my kids were, oh gosh, I don't remember their ages at the time. I think they were like 13 or 12 and 8 or 9, something like that. And their dad and I were no longer together, but we're very friendly and collaborative co-parents. And so when I moved to LA, we had to make the decision of, are the kids going to move with me, or are they going to stay with him? And we had a lot of logistical difficulty there. And then they ended up moving with me in LA. And now I got a job as a professor at Temple, and I'll be starting at Temple this semester, actually, next week.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm very excited. But that introduced a lot of logistical difficulty, because now my son's going into his senior year of high school. My daughter's going to her last year of middle school. They have their friends here. And even though I don't have any family, and I have way less support now, everyone moved their separate ways after grad school, and LA is not the easiest place to make friends or parent friends. So I am in that space again where I'm like, oh, I don't have a network here. but I have to make a choice for the kids. And so
Yeah.
I actually negotiated to stay 2 years longer in LA, um,
Mm.
and to move to Philly after my son graduated high school, because I just couldn't, for me, it wasn't ethical for me to choose my career over his
Mm.
career. And he's in a
Yeah.
point where he needed to make good choices about his football career and where he gets to go to college. The last couple of years of high school, it's so important for you and formative.
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
same for my daughter. Middle school is a very formative time, and disrupting their lives at that time for my own
Mhm.
career move was not, it didn't sit right with me. They, like I said, they've been my role dogs this whole time. They've always been like, we support you, mom, we want you to have what
Mhm.
you need. So
Yeah.
that time I chose them. And it's been difficult, but my university was like very agreeable and is letting me teach online. So, there's different experiences, but I think
Mhm.
ultimately you have to make the choice that's best for you and your family
Right.
at that time. And I also think it's really important to be open to experiences. Like, moving across the country was probably the best thing that I could have done for me and my children.
Mm. Mhm.
And I did look at, sorry, your other question, I did look at universities around me, but I didn't get into those, or they
Okay.
didn't give me a package that was feasible. So I went to the
Yeah.
university that wanted me, and that
Yeah.
happened to be
Yeah.
across the country.
Nice. Thanks so much for sharing that perspective, especially around moving with young kids versus moving with older kids. Definitely something that I'm thinking a lot about. I have young kids now, but just thinking about like life trajectory. So that's really great context for me, and I know that there are people who are probably listening who might also have kids thinking about going to grad school or currently in grad school and thinking about the next step. So that's really helpful context. I'm glad I remembered the second thing that I wanted to follow up on from your opening thoughts was you said something along the lines of you're thinking about getting additional degrees so that people can like won't say no, give you no reason to say no. And I've always thought of the PhD as like the ultimate, like I am an expert. There is absolutely nothing that you can say to me because I am those three letters give me enough credibility. But to hear you say that you're thinking about pursuing additional degrees, not necessarily for the learning capacity, and not to say that that isn't one of the reasons, but you specifically called out like for credibility and respect. So can you talk a little bit about one, why you wanted to pursue a PhD in the context of credibility, but two, what it is about being a Black woman with a PhD that still wants to get additional certifications in order to continue to earn respect in her field?
Yeah. And I would say it's not really about respect. Like, I say that kind of
Mm,
jokingly, like so that no one can deny me, but
yeah.
really it's about expertise and access. Um, I decided to get a PhD because that was the highest level of education, and I valued education. I was a good student. I love positive feedback from professors, right? So I just was like, I'm gonna keep that going. That's what
Yeah.
I think I'm supposed to do. I did, as I said, I did not understand that academia was its own profession. And so I'm thinking I'm going to get my PhD studying journalism so that I can be a professor of journalism because I'm a
Mm,
journalist and this is what I do. I
mm,
want to teach it as well. I want to impact the future of journalism by impacting journalism education. And I had a lot of critiques of journalism education. So if I have a
mhm,
problem with something, I have a rule, I have to go do something about it. I can't
mhm.
complain about something that I'm not willing to do something about. So
Yeah.
for me, getting a PhD was about, um, just getting access to being a professor. And as I got into academia and I learned, wow, there's this whole thing with its own conferences, and I'm learning what this
Yeah.
is. And I was really behind because a lot of my fellow, my classmates and my cohort, they, even though many of them were also first gen and second gen Americans, they had more proximity to that level
Mhm,
of knowledge. They had gone to the UC system, so R1s were
mhm.
teaching them something very different than what I was receiving in terms of access and
Yeah.
like access to certain knowledges at an HBCU. And I went to an art school for my MFA. They weren't really preparing their MFA students to like go on to doctoral education. They're preparing you to be an artist. So
Yeah.
I had all of these different perspectives, and getting a PhD helped me get this different perspective on academia. And with that, like now I'm in a position where, my PhD has opened so many doors. I do feel very respected and appreciated and validated in many spaces that I would otherwise not have been previously. Um, but there are things about society that I think are still, like having legal expertise would be very important and helpful for my community, for my activism work, for my students. So that's something that I'm interested in just knowing more about. I have zero interest in being a lawyer. I've never wanted to be a lawyer, but having legal expertise and that knowledge, I think would be incredibly useful.
Yeah.
So that's something I've been thinking about. I don't really want to go to law school, but I'll check it out. I like logic. And then the thing with thinking about business school, actually, the other day I sit on a board and we were doing a CEO search, and someone mentioned to me, like, Tara, have you thought about putting your name in? And no one had ever put me and CEO in the same sentence. And I was just thinking about like that really threw me. It was, it was very gratifying and validating, and I certainly appreciated. And I was thinking about growing up. My mom was a secretary for CFO of a big bank, and I used to do my homework sitting on their, like, the highest floor in the tallest building in Atlanta, the tallest building south of the Mason-Dixon line, where all of these entirely white male rooms, of power, had something that I had no connection mentally. There was, like, no possibility in my mind that I could be one of those people. I didn't even understand what a pathway to that looked like. And so to actually have a powerful, wealthy white man turn to me and say, well, what if you become the CEO? What if you apply? That was, like, mind blowing. And so then I started looking at the job description, and I realized, I'm like, I actually could do this job but there are a couple things that I'm not knowledgeable about, and they're primarily business specific things. And so then I was like, well, how do I get that expertise? Now, how do I be the whole package that I would like to be, so that if I am in a position to have a CEO or some other C-suite role, that I can hit the ground running and do an excellent job. And so I was then looking at, like, instead of maybe a whole MBA, I'm kind of tired of school, but like also maxed out on student loans. I'm looking at, like, business certificates and from Wharton and things like that. So it's not just about respect. I think it's about positioning yourself to have the knowledge and expertise to do the things that you want to do in the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for clarifying and sharing that. So let's talk about your kind of academic trajectory. How did you first get interested in journalism and communications? Was there a class that you took in undergrad? Was there something that happened in your childhood? Why pursue that academic path?
Yeah. I think I was just, like, watching too much superhero stuff as a like, as a child, where all the superheroes moonlight as journalists. Like, I got in my head that the way to change the world, if you didn't have superpowers, was to be a journalist. And in many ways, I think that still has some truth to it, but also journalists don't change the world. Journalists tell the story of world change. And and so I'm on a different path with that mentally. But at the time, I was very into being a journalist, and so I always wanted to be a writer, and I thought I was going to be working at, like, I don't know, Teen Vogue or something in New York. And so I started writing. Like, I co-founded my student newspaper in high school with a friend of mine who also went on to be a renowned, a journalist. Um, and then I got into this wonderful program that was a, a newspaper for teens by teens in Atlanta, called Vox. And that space was just so wonderful. I learned so much there. And that I got my first photo and story published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution when I was 17. And so then I was just, I was really bitten by it. When I saw my stuff in print, I was like, oh, this is what I will be doing. And so I went to college for journalism, and I got internships in journalism. And my first job out of college was as a photojournalist. And so at a certain point, I kind of transitioned from writing to photography. I loved photography. I still do a ton of writing. Now I write a lot about photography, but I also write news and stories to accompany my photography
Mhm.
and film work. And yeah, so it started in kind of like high school and then continued through
Mhm.
college, and that was my career. And then I transitioned to journalism education because I had,
Mhm.
as I said, I had a lot of opinions about how things should be being done, and I wanted to be sharing those opinions because they were not being heard in the newsroom. Nobody cared what I had to say.
Mm.
I was like a 27-year-old with two kids working in like the low ranks of editorial. No one was interested in my opinions. But then I go and get a PhD. I got the same opinions, and all of a sudden they're flying me
Well,
out to
well,
tell them
well.
about it. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. I love it. So what were some of the successes and challenges that you experienced during your time at UC San Diego? You already mentioned one of the positives being the graduate housing environment, kind of being able to grow up in to have your kids grow up around other kids in graduate housing. But what were some of the other highlights and some of the other challenges of grad school?
Um, well, I'll speak to the challenges first so I can end on a nice note. As I mentioned, I didn't really understand academia and I was behind my peers in terms of my exposure to it, but I far exceeded my peers in terms of work experience. And like many of the people I was in classes with had gone straight into PhD
Yeah.
from their undergrad, or they had just done like a year of something. They didn't have full careers that, where they had been a professional and were coming to grad school. There were a couple folks like, but generally, I was unusual in that regard. And so I wasn't coming, I didn't understand this kind of like advisor, advisee,
Mm-hmm.
this, you're kind of some sort of parental figure and I am a child and I should just take
Mm-hmm.
whatever you say at face value. I didn't know that that was an unspoken agreement, and no one told me because it's unspoken.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was constantly transgressing the hierarchies of academia, unbeknownst to me. I was like, I'm in a class. Classes are where you ask questions and you critique and you clarify, right? I didn't know that when they said, we're going to talk about Foucault and Marx and whatever, that I was just supposed to passively consume that knowledge and accept that all of these
Mm-hmm.
white men were, speaking absolute truths or whatever. So I was asking questions like, well, why do we start with Marx? Well, why are we studying this thing? Well, why is this person so valid and why is this person not valid? And then I asked the crazy questions where I was like, so I noticed that a lot of the scholars we're studying actually come from the UC system or are like from the West Coast. Is that because there's just a shit ton of knowledge production coming specifically from here? Or is it a total bias because you don't think that other people's knowledges are valid? And they were like, what is happening here? Um, and I will say that, now in my perspective, being a professor, I was coming in really hot. I actually had a full on argument in class with one of my professors in our first year that terrified all of my cohort. They were like, "Why is she doing this?" And I was like, "Well, they said this thing, and now they're going back on it, and that can't happen. I need clarity around." So I was like, not everyone's favorite, and
Mm,
um, they really tried to push me out in that first year.
mm,
There was an agreement amongst the faculty that I learned later that I wasn't going to succeed and that I, in fact, was not cut out for grad school. And, luckily we had this really arcane process of taking tests anonymously. Like we had 1 week to write
mhm,
8 essays. They get graded anonymously. And so everyone to as it was told to me, the faculty who were tasked with, preparing us for grad school had already given up on me and decided that I wasn't cut out for this and were kind of actively working against me, telling me they were going to give me an A, but then actually giving me B's, which, as you probably know, or I don't know if this is true everywhere, but anything less than an A in in a doctoral class is like a letter of like not, it's it's basically saying you don't belong here. Um, and so they were doing these little tactics, and then I took that test, the exam, where I'm writing about all of these ideas that they've been instilling us, and I passed with flying colors to everyone's surprise. And they couldn't they couldn't do anything about it because it's anonymous. So they thought I was going to fail. I didn't fail. I did better than several of my other cohort, according to the professor who I'd actually originally argued with, who was the one who was like, listen, I'm just going to give it to you straight. No one believes you're going to do well. Everyone's kind of betting on you failing. And then a couple people continued to try to push me out. And one of them was actually the chair of my department, a white woman who tried to find every excuse that she could, oddly enough, to get me to leave grad school. Procedural things, like just all kinds of things. But I kept winning grants and awards and having projects and publications, and I was actually the first to graduate on time in my, or the only person to graduate on time, doing all of the things that were required of us in my cohort. I'll say that. And yeah, so I like a challenge, and they challenged me because I had challenged them, and I learned a lot from that. And I will say that if I had come into my doctoral program without having had 10 years of being messed with by white people in journalism, if I hadn't been yelled at and tried to, and like had people try to push me out in journalism, like all of the things that happened to me in grad school had already happened to me. And I was like, y'all have nothing on the crazy folks in journalism. You don't even know how to do this. So I was like, that's cute, but you're not going to get me. And I'm like, I'm so glad that I did show up with that kind of previous experience, because that would have wrecked me. Like that, like the way that they went about doing that, the insidiousness of and the way that they like call into question like your intelligence. And that was something that no one had ever called. I was valedictorian of my high school. I was top of my class every year. No one had ever tried to make me feel stupid. Unworthy, yes, like invalid, untalented, these other things that had happened to me in journalism, yes, but no one in journalism had ever called into question my intelligence. And so that was a new one in academia. But I'm really ultimately I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful that they were doing it to me because I could handle it. And and I think like that also helped me know what sorts of shenanigans they get up to, and so I can better prepare my colleagues and my friends, and that has been very meaningful for me. So in terms of highlights, really just having the space to learn. I learned so much. I'm a different person intellectually. The way I understand the world is just radically different, in large part due to the time I spent in my doctoral program. And even though I had a sense about, the world, the way that the social order functions related to race and gender and citizenship, like I was living those things, but I couldn't put my lived experience into words. And I certainly didn't have the like centuries of writing to contextualize, well, this is how we got here. These people were writing in this way and philosophizing in this way that dehumanized me, and these people have been speaking from the subaltern and radicalizing our thinking, but we're not hearing about that in most places. So if you're not seeking that knowledge out yourself or getting a PhD, it's hard to come by. And I mean, it's becoming more of the cultural lexicon now, but in 2012 people weren't talking about bell hooks like in the streets. They were talking about othering and like that, all the stuff that is now like in the social Uber is like, that was not, so I'm really excited that more people are having more access to this knowledge and information. And for me, it was a revelation. And just being able to pursue so many different projects, and understanding like that there are these resources that will pay you to do your ideas, and those ideas can help the world, and they can change, like I can do things that affect change now through my job as a professor, that will change the lives of people like my mother, who I couldn't have imagined, that I would have been able to do that years ago. So there's so many wonderful things that came from getting my doctorate.
I love that we ended on the positive note, because woo, the struggle. I love how you framed your perspective and experience, the fact that you had that work experience and in a field that is, from what I've heard, quite challenging. And so being able to have experienced pushback from other people in journalism prepared you for the pushback in academia. I'm curious because I'm trying to put myself in your shoes. I'm curious after seeing the very ugly side of academia, especially faculty and academia, lack of support, intentional efforts to push you out. Why then continue on in academia and become a professor? Why not carry out your research as an independent scholar or continue photojournalism work out? Like, why still not play the academic game, but yeah, why still continue in a career in academia, knowing how messy it can be and really experiencing the ugliest side of it?
Well, if there's somewhere that someone really doesn't want me to be, that means I absolutely must be there.
Mm,
So
yeah.
the fact, and this is something that I really struggle with because I'm always telling my like women of color and like queer and trans folks of color colleagues, they're like, I just can't deal with this. I'm gonna quit. And I'm like, please
Yeah.
don't quit. We need you. We need you in journalism. We need you in academia. We need you in the classroom. We need you fighting the good fight.
Yeah.
And I do feel that deeply. I also feel like you have to take care of yourself, right? So if something
Right.
is threatening your life and livelihood, like your ability to have joy, then you have to make different choices. But I derive joy from succeeding where others try to make me fail.
Mm,
So,
yeah. Love that.
even though it is like it's not a good feeling to work with people who don't respect you and who are actively trying to move against you, let me be clear. That is the entire world. I'm a Black queer woman.
Mm, yeah.
The entire world is trying to move against me. So
Yeah.
at some point, I have to say, well, this thing, I'm not going to I'm not going to go. If you're trying to push me out, the one thing you can be certain of is that I will not be leaving of my own volition because I'm not going
Yeah.
to give you what you wanted
Mm,
the easy
yeah.
way. Like, no, you're going to stay here in the struggle with me. So, for me, quitting wasn't really an option. I considered transferring. I was like, maybe I'll go to a different
Mm,
university where they'll treat me better. But I had too many other good things.
yeah.
And then I was like, I became a union organizer. I was like working with the grad student
Mm,
organization,
nice.
and that is what I do when someone is trying to push me out, or like, I feel like this isn't a welcoming space. I just dig in deeper, like, okay, well, what are the structures that make this unwelcoming for people like me? What are the what are the pain points that I can get a position of power to help myself and others like me and whoever comes after me? And for me, that was like working in the graduate student organization, and I became a vice president of like equity and diversity inclusion to work on these issues across the university. And then I started union organizing for grad students. So
Yeah.
all of that helped me find my people who did respect me, who valued me,
Yeah.
and made it possible for me to do this work. And
Mhm.
I I wasn't in academia uh, to be like deemed this really important and interesting scholar. I came into academia because I wanted to teach the next generation of journalists, and I wanted journalism education to be more accessible and open to women and people of color.
Yeah.
So that didn't change. Like, whether I ever write a book that everyone loves, or I'm not interested in that kind of
Mm,
seeking scholarly gratification. I'm interested in being in the classroom and affecting change at a level that will trickle into other aspects of American social
yeah.
life. So they weren't going to stop me from doing that. For what?
Mm, yeah.
They don't have that power.
Yes, 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 yes. I had a feeling that you would have a really motivational answer, so I'm really glad that I asked that question. I love how you said if someone doesn't want me somewhere, that is a sign that I need to be there. I feel like that's really, really, really great advice for folks. I have a question about your career as a visual journalist and storyteller. How do you go about crafting narratives that reflect the experiences of marginalized folks, such as Black, LGBTQ plus and diaspora communities?
Um, well, I hope that I do reflect those experiences. I think that's always a process, and I'm always questioning myself, like, do I, is this the story I should be telling? Do I belong here? Like,
Yeah.
is there someone else who could do a better job at this, or could do a more intimate job because they're more intimately connected to a community? But ultimately, I ask myself, like, how would I want my family to be portrayed? Um, what do I want people to know about the immigrant experience, about what it means to be Black in the US, about what it means to be Afro-Caribbean or queer? Like, what do I value about these spaces? And that's what I want to photograph. This is why I focus on joy, community, family, like love. Those are the things that I think make um, make compelling images and tell true stories, accurate stories of who people are. And when you see images of people loving each other and working together, and then you find out what they are going through, and they're managing to do this, like, that is a totally different relationship to those people in those images and what they deserve, and what I need, like what I am called on as a viewing audience member, as a public, as like part of their shared citizenry. That is a different relationship to what I think I need to do for my fellow human being than just seeing someone in the moment of the worst day of their life. That's like, oh no, this terrible thing has happened to them. I have no frame of reference for that terrible thing. How terrible. But if it's like, oh look, they're living a beautiful, joyous life just like I live or my friends live or I want to live, and they're doing that despite all of this other shit, well hell, like, let's get in these streets. Like, so I think, that's my personal take on that. It's not that I think that we should never have images of struggle. Like, we do need to unveil the horrors of this world that we visit upon each other as humans, but we also need to make space for joy and for, what are we even fighting for? Like, if everything is terrible, then we can all just die, right? But no, there is something we're fighting for: love and our children and those moments of happiness. So, like, we have to see that. If we don't see that, and we're not taking the time to acknowledge that everyone can and should have access to that, then are we really telling the story of the world? Are we telling anything true? So that's what I think about when I'm doing this work, and I try to show images that I haven't seen before, or seen a lot of, or try to make images that I haven't seen a lot of. And I'm happy to say that that's getting harder and harder because we have such an influx of um it's getting harder and harder to kind of like make images I haven't seen before, because so many people are doing this wonderful work of reframing the visual lexicon of around people of color, around people from colonized nations, around women, around queer and trans folks, so around people with disabilities. Like, all of these different communities are being shown now in their beautiful entirety, their complexity, the nuance. And so I'm happy that I'm just, sometimes I'm like, all right, like, I don't even know if I need to tell this story. Like, 8 other people are doing it. That's great. So let me go see if there's something else I need to tell.
I love that you feel like the field is already moving in the direction that your goal of educating the future generation of journalists, it's like it's already coming to life. Like, you are having to do less of the work because there are more and more people who are telling the stories that you're interested in capturing, and telling those stories of joy, those stories of optimism, those stories of resilience, that you're 100% right. They're so rarely shown. And so, but like, without them, like, what is there to be fighting for? Like, why are we struggling? So I really like that perspective, especially as someone who, in the past couple of months has started to feel pretty like pessimistic about life. I think it's such a great reminder that we need to see joy. We need to see us living happily together in community with one another, because that's what really keeps us going and drives us forward. So thanks so much for doing the work and for inspiring others to do the work as well. So I have 2 short questions. We ask all of our guests to reflect a little bit about their own doctoral journey and then give some advice. So first question is, what is one thing that you would do differently, if any, if you had to do your doctoral journey all over again?
I would go to a university that offered me a better package, financial
Mm,
package, because I mentioned I went to the university that wanted me.
mhm.
I
Yeah.
wish that I had been in a position to
Mm,
continue applying.
mm,
Um, and also just I didn't know. I mean, I wrote like my materials, my application materials were so embarrassing because I didn't know what I was supposed to be writing to. I didn't have an advisor that was like, this is what this is. So I was just kind of
yeah.
following the prompts and trying to make sense of it. Um, so I know that, I could have gotten into different schools
Mm,
that maybe the programs would have been more aligned with I'm very happy with what I ended up doing because UCSD had their communication department had such a great, like intellectually interdisciplinary
mm,
and methodologically interdisciplinary space. So, and that was very, formative and beneficial for me. Whereas I would have gone to like another like a more journalism focused university and might not have
mhm.
gotten or program rather might not have gotten as
Right.
much out of it. So I think be open to
Mm,
a different experience than you might have thought you needed, but also like get that money. Like be really
mhm.
realistic about
Yeah.
what you need to survive because my first couple years of grad school as a TA, I was making $18,000 raising two children in Southern California.
Wow.
So I had to take out a ton of student loans just for us to live. I didn't have to pay, college, everything was like that was paid for tuition. And that was the first time I had had health insurance as an adult. Like that was really incredible. Because I couldn't afford it as a journalist.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
there are so many things that were financially beneficial, but making 18K, like being under the poverty line, like so much of
Yeah.
academia is predicated on this idea that you
Yes.
have some kind of generational wealth or that you have like a partner who
Yes.
is making money. And
Mhm.
I don't think that the powers that be even realize that that is like what it's
Yeah.
structured on, even at this
Yeah.
point, as we've been doing so much pushback against academia's ivory tower. So, if you can be honest with yourself about your financial situation and be really adamant, like, this is what I need to survive,
Yeah.
I think that's really important while also maintaining, having some space for it to be like you're not going to make a salary, right? It's not going to
Yeah.
be the same as like you're still going to struggle a little bit. It's not grad
Yep.
school is not for you to like make money, but make
Yeah.
sure you
Yeah.
can live, like
Right.
that's what I would
Mhm.
say. Don't be so like
Yes.
don't feel so beholden to that piece of paper that says congratulations, you've been, you're in our
Mhm.
program. Like if they're not offering you what you need to live, then they're not offering you anything worth you considering.
Mm. Yeah. So that was a reflection on your journey combined with a piece of advice. So thank you so much, Dr. Pixley, for joining us on the Cohort Sisters podcast, for sharing your story of how you got to and through your doctoral degree despite a lot of odds against you, despite people trying to actively push you out. But I am so excited to hear that you not only persevered, but you're continuing to do the work of training the next generation of journalism scholars by transforming journalism education. We will include in the show notes places for folks to see all of your amazing work. I was like on your website, such beautiful photojournalism that you do.
Oh,
So
thank you.
really excited for other people to see your work. And congratulations again on the new role and safe travels, I guess in 2 years when you
one
move.
one year I've
Okay.
already done my first year and now my son is finishing his senior year, so we just got one more year and then I'm coming to Philly.
Nice. Nice, nice. Well, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the work that you do telling our stories and bringing that to a wider audience. So thank you so much for your labor and your brilliance and your time.
Absolutely.